Resuming debate, the honourable member for Fredericton.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Let me begin by saying I unequivocally support this bill. And as a new member of Parliament, I didn't have the opportunity to state my support for this legislation in the last Parliament, so I'm very thankful for the opportunity to do it now. It is my hope that once passed and proclaimed, this legislation ushers in a new era of change, one of accountability and trust within our legal system, one of real justice for the women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people facing sexual violence every day. In the 43rd Parliament, a record number of 98 women were elected to this House. The statistics on sexual assault say that 32%, 1 in 3 women over the age of 15, will be sexually assaulted in their lifetime. And that's only based on the reported data. That means that as female parliamentarians, we come to this House and to this debate with lived experience. I also have the lived experience of being a resource teacher for youth, of having dozens of children disclose to me the traumas that they have endured in their lives, the mental anguish and stress, the inability to trust. I have sat in courtrooms where abusers have more rights than the victim, where delay tactics and games prolong the experience until a victim gives up, until they have been worn down enough from inaction and intimidation. To think that Canadian judges, those entrusted to uphold our law, to protect victims and to deter further crimes, could be complicit in lending power to abusers through such ignorance and gaslighting is unthinkable. I wish to thank Rona Ambrose for having the courage to bring this issue into the light with her private member's bill, and I wish to thank the Liberal government for bringing it back as Bill C3, and for my colleagues on all sides of this House for their words, their solidarity, and their support for seeing this through. I would be remiss if I did not include the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and the ongoing systemic racism in our legal system. New Brunswick's chiefs are calling for a full inquiry into the failures of our system for Indigenous peoples, particularly women whose lives have not been given the respect and dignity they deserve. The issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women has deep roots from the early days of colonization, where invading forces recognized the power and stature of women in traditional Indigenous society. Just as they intentionally decimated the buffalo because they were the lifeblood of the Indigenous economy on the plains, they decimated the population of Indigenous women as the lifeblood of the people. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls final report reveals that persistent and deliberate human and Indigenous rights violations and abuses are the root cause behind Canada's staggering rates of violence against Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people. Testimony from family members and survivors gives context to this violence, marked by multi-generational and intergenerational trauma and marginalization. This takes the form of poverty, insecure housing or homelessness, and barriers to education, employment, healthcare, and cultural support. Experts and knowledge keepers spoke to specific colonial and patriarchal policies that displaced women from their traditional roles in communities and governance and diminished their status in society, leaving them vulnerable to violence and sexual assault. The human rights and Indigenous rights abuses committed and condoned by the Canadian state represent genocide against Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people. Given the failures of our education system to confront these realities until recently, we find ourselves in a position where the people with the responsibility to offer justice to survivors of sexual violence are from a generation when consent was not part of the discussion, when the burden was put on women to avoid being sexually assaulted rather than holding men accountable for their sexual violence, when consideration of how many sexual partners a woman had reflected on her worth as a person, when the intersectionality of misogyny and racism was not well understood. This is reflected in some of the comments that have been made by judges in recent years, wondering why a woman couldn't simply keep her knees together, or commenting that she should be flattered to have received the attention, or reinforcing the flawed notion that a drunk woman can provide consent. This shows without a shadow of a doubt that many judges are not well educated on sexual assault. They have the power to influence the victim's recovery, but in many cases we see that the victim is left re-traumatized and without justice. Judges are entrusted with an important job that carries a number of privileges, but also comes with significant responsibilities. And if they are missing important knowledge surrounding myths and stereotypes and biases, their ability to accurately interpret the facts and the law will be impacted. Until our bench more accurately reflects the makeup of our society, it is essential that we ensure judges are empowered with the education they need to do their job effectively. Rape is not about sex. It is about power. It is our job as parliamentarians to ensure our system restores power to those who have had it taken from them. Perhaps someday our legal system will live up to its other name, Canada's justice system, but we're not there yet. Thank you.
Questions et commentaires? Questions and comments? The honourable member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I thank my colleague for her speech, and I think many important points have been raised by her and by many members in the House today during this important debate. And I'm glad the conversation is happening, and I know that even when conversations happen in this place, when people see maybe they're encouraged to come forward and seek counseling, seek support, these kinds of things. I wonder if the member can just share a little bit more about what additional steps that we can take as parliamentarians. This is, as has been pointed out, a relatively small step. We're requiring training for people at a fairly late stage in their career. What more can we do to respond to this problem, to work together to address sort of the broader, long-standing issues that she spoke to in her remarks?
The honourable member for Fredericton.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank my honourable colleague for that, amazing question. There's so much more that we need to be doing, and I think it's such a multifaceted issue. We mentioned some of the, health outcomes, education outcomes. There's so many aspects that we need to really address here. But I think my mind went directly to the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women in particular, and the need for the actions to actually start happening. But a big piece of that is Canada to actually acknowledge the genocide. And I know we've had a hard time saying that word in connection with our own country, but until we can have that truth, that reconciliation piece isn't there, and the justice piece isn't there. So that's a big thing I'd like to see from all of my colleagues, is to acknowledge the genocide that has occurred in our country. Thank you very much for that question.
The honourable member for Shefford.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je remercie ma collègue de Fredericton pour son discours et je la félicite également pour la nomination de sa nouvelle chef au sein du Parti vert. J'ai senti beaucoup de sensibilité de ma collègue, évidemment, pour la question particulièrement des femmes et des filles autochtones disparues et assassinées. C'est un dossier qui me tient particulièrement à cœur et que j'espère avoir la chance d'étudier au sein du comité permanent de la condition féminine. Mais j'aimerais l'entendre sur la question des délais pour voter ce projet de loi-là. J'aimerais qu'elle me parle du fait qu'effectivement, les libéraux ont prorogé le Parlement, ce qui a retardé effectivement ce projet de loi, qui a fait que ça a tombé, qu'on a dû repartir avec un autre projet de loi. J'aimerais l'entendre aussi avec le fait que les conservateurs, juste à la dernière session, n'ont pas voté la motion du NPD qui aurait pu effectivement accélérer l'adoption de ce projet de loi-là. Je pense que dans ce cas-ci, on s'entend tous pour dire que cette formation-là des juges, ça ne réglera pas toute la question importante des violences faites envers les femmes, mais que c'est un pas, et un pas important pour y arriver.
The honourable member for Fredericton.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Merci à ma collègue pour cette question excellente. And I think that we've heard a little bit about the kind of the filibustering or delay tactics with this bill, but as an opposition member, I am honored to have the opportunity to speak to it. So it's interesting to see that come from our Liberal colleagues when Parliament was prorogued, or we had a delay already of several weeks. So there's games being played on all sides, and these issues are far too important for any games to be played. And I respect my colleague across the way so much, because she is always fighting for the most vulnerable in her community without delay, calling for action, and I feel a lot of camaraderie with her. And so that's what we all need to be doing. Enough of the games. Let's get the work done. So thank you very much for that question.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Yes, Madam Speaker, reclaiming power and place, the final report that came from the murdered and missing women and girls is something in which ultimately I can recall advocating for that inquiry to be taking place when we were in opposition, and very, very much concerned and passionate, as I know all members are, in regards that when we move on the issue of reconciliation. And one of the bills that we were hoping to get to was Bill C5, which deals with one of the calls for action. And my question to my colleague is, does she believe that we do need to continue to have the dialogue and deal with some of these issues in a more timely fashion, so that we're able to deal with more legislation?
The honourable member for Fredericton, a brief answer, please.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for that question. We absolutely need to move quickly. We need to speed things up for sure, and I'd love to get to C5. I also have my support on the table for that. But to say that I wouldn't allow other parliamentarians to have the opportunity to speak to this bill as I have just been given, I don't think would be fair. So if that's what the opposition needs is to continue to speak to this bill, then I think they should have that opportunity. Again, it's a day of opposition motions when we've had or opposition time when we've had 5 weeks of Parliament prorogued. So I think in comparison, this is part of the process, and I would allow them to use the time as they need it. Thank you very much.